Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for all turning out to hear me talk. It's a very large audience. I hope it'll be worth your while. So, as the chair has said, my name is Toby Dodge. I run the Middle East Centre, and I'm a professor in the International Relations Department. But first, as with any good set of students, what you need to do, and I'll help you with this, is identify my bias. So I teach foreign policy analysis in an international relations department, where the vast majority of my colleagues teach straightforward international relations. So what I want to do today is not only introduce my approach to foreign policy analysis, but convince you that foreign policy analysis is the most exciting way to do international relations, but beyond that, the most exciting way to do social science more generally. So if I were going to give this lecture a title, could you change the slide, please? If I were going to give, and again, thanks. If I were going to give this lecture a title, it could be Into the Oval Office with a bag load of explanatory theory. So the central concern of foreign policy analysis is to understand why and how decisions were made. Why this man, Barak Obama, and I think his Vice President, Joe Biden, have made a series of decisions, maybe some of them good, a lot of them bad, and why the decision they made in Libya caused thousands upon thousands of people to be murdered. So this is an incredibly important topic that largely concerns itself with why very, very powerful, smart, educated, powerful people make so many bad decisions. So that's the pitch. Foreign policy analysis will give you, and hopefully gives me, the theoretical tools to go into the Kremlin, into the Oval Office, into number 10 Downing Street in London, into the Quai d'Orsay, anywhere, and anywhere where foreign policy is being made, and explain why and how those decisions were made. Can we go to the next slide, thanks. So let's just briefly have a series of definitions of what foreign policy is. Clearly, it's the sum of official, outward-looking decisions. It's the foreign policy, it's the policies taken to reach explicit goals of states or any organization that operates at the international level. So basically, it's about individual decision makers making decisions that project the power of their states out into the international. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, what I want to do first is define foreign policy analysis and divide it from international relations. So foreign policy analysis is a micro perspective on international relations. And this can be contrasted with the macro perspective that explains international relations from the level of the international system. So what we're doing, why foreign policy analysis is better than international relations, it goes from the very general down to the very specific. As we'll see, why one decision was taken by one man on one night and why that resulted in regime change in Libya and thousands of people dying. Now, international relations looks at the level of causality, why things happen at the international system, and what it tends to do is what we'd call black box or close off the state itself. So if we're doing international relations, we're looking at big sweeping gestures, what states do to each other, without actually looking at the decision makers at the level of the state itself. Now, you could argue in international relations, individuals, people, tend to disappear. They're not important. that international relations deducts what people are doing from the actions of the state, the final end point of what the state does. So if you look at slide 6, this is Kenneth Waltz, the founder of Neorealism, who published 2 hugely influential books, Man, the State and War, and A Theory of International Politics. So this is probably the most famous theorist in international relations. And he says basically international politics is not foreign policy. And then we go to the next slide, and we have the most influential theorist within international relations today, Alexander Wendt, who published this book, The Social Theory of International Politics, so a constructivist. And he says, I'm interested in the structure and the effects of states. Like Kenneth Waltz, I'm interested in international politics and not foreign policy. So this is what I'm up against as a foreign policy analyst. The 2 great figures within my own discipline overtly refuse to recognize what I do as international relations. So there's a bit of a grudge match going on. Now, foreign policy analysis seeks to go right to where it matters. The people who are more powerful than us, whose decisions affect our everyday lives, their decisions for foreign policy analysis are what matters, are what causes the effects in the international system. So basically we go down and we look at the individuals and we look at why they've made those decisions. If we go to the next slide. And that we do that on 3 levels of analysis. The first level is the institutions that decision makers operate within. And there's something called Miles' law, which says where you stand depends on where you sit. What that means, basically, is a straight attack on international relations. If international relations sees the state as a single, rational, coherent whole, it in effect imagines the state as an individual that acts in a unit, that acts cohesively and coherently, and acts as one. That, I would suggest, gently, is rubbish. Because when we actually look at the state itself, it's made up of many different institutions, in any case, many different ministries. And when all those ministers come together in the cabinet to make decisions about foreign policy, they argue, they disagree, they fight. So instead of the state being one coherent whole, it's much more accurate to see it at a sub-level as broken up and disjointed. So from that point of view, any single decision, as we'll see in the case study, is not the outcome of rational, coherent, unitary thinking, but the outcome of a ghastly compromise between different powerful politicians arguing with each other, each representing the different institutions within government. So if I have a great foreign policy idea like, oh, let Britain leave the European Union, that'll be a smart thing to do, and I am the foreign minister, I bring it into the cabinet, and I have to argue and debate with other ministers, the Minister of Economics, the Home Office, these different ministers argue. So the final decision is a compromise and a mess, not the clear vision of one person. Then we bring it down, to the second level, the group. If you think most foreign policy decision-making is done in a small group of people, either a cabinet or 6 or 7 people. Now, you know yourselves, when you get together with a group of friends or in a seminar and discussion, each of you puts pressure on each other or negotiates or discusses with each other. And in foreign policy decision-making, this has been found to enforce consensus. So it's very difficult, or it can be difficult, if the president or the prime minister of a state says, I want to do this. and you're one of his ministers not as powerful, it's very difficult to disagree with her or him, to develop a counter-argument. So the next level down is the group. And then the final, and I suspect most important level, is the individual, the actor-specific. Basically, how do you, I would ask, understand the world? How do you process information about the world? How do you make sense of the world? Because ultimately you or I are not hugely different from the individuals who make decisions. So when you make a mistake, when you do something that you regret and you reflect on it, why did I get that wrong? Why didn't I understand the complexity of the situation? We should do the same for foreign policy decision makers. We should ask why they get things wrong so often. Now, if we go to that slide. So broadly, within foreign policy decision making, seeking to understand the individual, there are three different models, most of which should be quite common to you. The first and the dominant one, and I suspect the one that you would use to guide your own lives, is rationality. That you go out to maximize the best you can get from any situation. And in foreign policy analysis and in international relations, this is the general default position. People like Waltz, a neo-realist, or neo-realists believe that states seek to constantly, in their interaction with each other, maximize the benefits for each individual state. So realists, as you know, think that the world is an anarchical place, that it's dangerous, that if a state makes a mistake, there's no one that's going to come and rescue it. So they're driving to maximize the best interest, usually to maximize the security they can gain from any one situation. However, this is problematic. I think this is ultimately unsustainable. Because if you think about your own life, or I think about my life, I can't possibly understand and rationally process all the information that is coming into me. I can't know everything, and I can't bring in a vast amount of information into every decision I make, and we'll see that about President Obama's decision on Libya. So the second school of thought sees your rationality, my rationality, and the rationality of senior decision makers as limited or bounded, as constrained. And these constraints place limits on their ability to act rationally. Now, how do you make sense of a complex situation? You use reductive or simplistic, like a roadmap, or comparative examples. So as we'll see, when President Obama was faced with a potential human rights abuse in Libya, the most powerful comparison that he could think of was the genocide in Rwanda. Is Libya like Rwanda? Now, it turns out Libya was nothing like Rwanda, but that powerful comparison shaped his mind, was Saddam Hussein like Hitler? That's called the Munich analogy, that if a dictator is aggressive and seeks to expand their territory, they must be stopped by violence if necessary, otherwise they will threaten global peace, like Hitler did. So George Bush Jr. and George Bush Sr. used the Munich analogy, Hitler in the run through the 1930s, to understand Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq. Now, both of these comparisons may strike you as ludicrous, that clearly Saddam Hussein was no Hitler, and that Libya bore little comparison to Rwanda. But foreign policy decision makers, when faced with a really difficult decision, a fast-moving situation, and lots of information, quite often reach for these comparisons to make sense of confusing or unsettling situations. They're still rational. They're still trying to do the best for their country, but they can't straightforwardly understand complexity, so they impose shortcuts on it. Much the same as you would look at a road map to find your way from A to B, they're looking for a way of simplifying situations. And the final approach is constructivism. This is probably the most difficult to understand, but also probably the most powerful. This argues that your own understanding of the world, my own understanding of the world, and foreign policy decision-makers' own understanding of the world comes centrally from the societies they were brought up in. So what I think is important, how I understand the world, what I think are the best interests even of my country, comes from the society that I was brought up in, comes from the central issues that my society thinks is right. Now, this has two quite important issues. The first is how my society teaches me right and wrong, teaches me good and bad, changes over time. So you could think that even Ronald Reagan, the United States president during the 1980s, has a radically different understanding of international relations to Barak Obama, the current president of the United States. But this constructivism argues his understanding of what's right and wrong, what's rational, may well differ greatly from Theresa May, the current Prime Minister in Britain. Now, if this is the case, that societies deliver rationality, right and wrong understandings, then that means there is no one single universal rationality. That the very underpinnings of realism, that we're all trying to do the same thing as statespeople, maximize our utility, may be subject to historical, cultural, and geographic changes. And that, I suspect, is a rather worrying and potentially subversive idea. So to sum up this section, foreign policy analysis examines individuals. So we go into the Prime Minister's office or the President's office and we ask the simple question, why did they make that decision and how did they make that decision? And then through, not that slide yet, and then through those two fairly simple questions, we ask at different levels of the state, did they make that decision representing the different ministries in government? Did they make that decision within different groups, within a group of 5 or 6 people, and did they make that decision on their own? And then did they make that decision through rationality, calmly, straightforwardly, taking a set of different options, working out what the different outcomes might be, and then working out what the best decision would be? Or did they use shortcuts, historical comparisons potentially, to try and process information? Or indeed, were the ideas prevalent in their society likely to be much more influential on what they thought was rational, what they thought was right or wrong? So you've got 3 big competing schools of understanding. They all take 1 or 2 decision makers, but they see the way that their brains work in radically different ways. So the rational approach sees their brain working very simply. There are 6 or 7 different options. Which is the best option for my state? The bounded rationality says they can't possibly know everything. None of us can know everything. We must find shortcuts to understand data. And the constructivist says that what they believe to be rational is actually shaped within their own societies. Now we can think of things, don't we? So all of that's very abstract, and I apologise for giving you this abstract data. So let's go to something very specific and a very colourful character who was murdered in a ditch in Libya, Colonel Gaddafi. So let's see how this works in practice during the Arab Spring of 2011. So the date that I'm going to focus on in my case study is the 15th of February 2011. It's at night in Washington, the day after Valentine's Day. That's not important, by the way. 3 months into the Arab Spring, President Barak Obama is sitting in the White House. Now think about Barak Obama. He was elected with great optimism, the American people, and we might say the world. Thank God George Bush has gone. This new, young, liberal president is in. But he was also elected specifically and deliberately to withdraw the United States from 2 bloody wars, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq. And I don't know if you remember, but just after he became president, he went to Cairo to give a speech that marked a new relationship with the Middle East. Certainly, he thought a relationship of trust, a relationship of dialogue, but also a relationship where he was basically promising that the United States would listen but interfere much less. So what Obama wanted to do was reduce his commitment to the Middle East, rebuild trust, and pull his armies out of Iraq and Afghanistan. He's only got a couple of months left in the office, and we could gently suggest he's failed. His troops are still in Afghanistan. His troops have gone back into Iraq, and I don't think there's a better relationship between the Middle East and himself. And one of the big reasons for that was the Arab Spring, these revolts that sprung up across the region in 2011. Now, one of the key examples of that is this country in Libya. In Libya, 3 months into the Arab Spring, you see a series of largely peaceful demonstrations start along here in this area around Benghazi and spread towards the capital, Tripoli. Now, to begin with, these demonstrations were peaceful, much the same as the demonstrations in Cairo or in Damascus and around Syria. But clearly, by the 20th of February, Colonel Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, who has a degree from the London School of Economics, has a PhD from the London School of Economics, I must admit, admitted in public that that much of eastern Libya, much of the area round Benghazi, was under rebel control. So the Gaddafi family and that regime were very close to losing control of their own country. Now, on the 3rd of March 2011, American President Obama publicly announced that Colonel Gaddafi, as leader of Libya, had lost all his legitimacy and should step down from power and leave the country at once. You remember he said that about Assad in Syria, and he's saying that about Gaddafi in Libya. To try and force Gaddafi to leave the country, President Obama closed the Libyan embassy in Washington, froze many of the financial assets, and then promoted international sanctions against Gaddafi to try and persuade him to stop using violence. All of these policies, closing the embassy, calling him to leave, putting sanctions on the country, had no influence on Gaddafi whatsoever. Instead, I think Gaddafi quite rightly realized that he and his family and his regime were in a fight for their very survival. And so instead of listening to President Obama, he increased the violence and repression and began to move his troops from Tripoli along the coast towards Benghazi, the city that had traditionally been the centre of protests against him. And if, in case anyone worried, anyone was in any doubt about what Gaddafi wanted to do, he broadcast on the radio, "It's all over. The revolt is over. We're coming to get you tonight. We will find you wherever you are. We will find you in your closet." That's the background to the foreign policy decision that Obama had to make. So on Tuesday, the 15th of March 2011, in Washington, D.C., over 3 meetings, over one night, Barack Obama took the decision to push for a new United Nations resolution on Libya that would allow the use of force to protect the Libyan population. In effect, this new resolution gave the international community the right to use military force against Colonel Gaddafi, and the justification for that force was the protection of the population of the city of Benghazi. Now, as we now all know, that resolution, once it passed, gave NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the military backing to use air power and to use special forces in support of the revolt against Gaddafi, and that resulted in Gaddafi being forced from power, the rebels seizing Tripoli, and Gaddafi eventually being murdered. Can we have the next slide, please? And there you go. That wonderful moment, victory in Tripoli, then Secretary of State Clinton flying into Tripoli, flipping the V sign, everyone was happy. Now, we know that's not the end of the story. We know that after the rebels got to Tripoli, Libya descended into a massive civil war that to a certain extent still goes on today. We know that the American ambassador to Libya was murdered in his consulate along with 2 colleagues, I think, and that the different militias that NATO and the Americans empowered with weapons, along with the United Arab Emirates, amongst others, are still fighting each other. So although the initial policy aim of the resolution was successful, we could argue the overall decision to go back to the United Nations to seek another resolution was an abject failure. That Libya descended into civil war, a civil war still going on. Daesh, the Islamic State, has a footprint now in Libya, and Libya is a font of instability. And we could also argue that the lives of ordinary Libyans have actually got worse because of the lawlessness and violence. So what we need to do is think about how and why, under foreign policy analysis, that crucial decision made by Barack Obama and his foreign policy team was made on the 15th of March 2011. So as I said at the beginning of this lecture, foreign policy analysis claims to be able to walk into the White House, walk up to the Oval Office, and explain to you how and why Barack Obama made that foreign policy decision and ultimately made that foreign policy mistake. Next slide, please. So there are 3, as I've touched upon before, there are 4 different models of foreign policy decision-making. This is Barack Obama's cabinet, and part of it, that's the Secretary of Defense Gates, and the key combat commanders, the heads of the army, the military, and the air force. Why did they make that mistake? How can we explain a very intelligent man, clearly at the moment the most powerful man in the world, how can we explain that he screwed up so badly. Now, the first theory, neoclassical realism, is a rationalist theory of foreign policy. And it would stress that during the night of the 15th of December, Barack Obama, in a very rationalist way, sat down and had 2 prolonged meetings with his military commanders and his civilian advisors. And on the table was the situation. Libyan troops moving down the coast from Tripoli towards Benghazi, a slaughter of thousands of people just about to happen. What are we going to do? So neoclassical realists would first argue that Obama and his foreign policy advisors sat down and said that one classic realist question: how do we maximize American interests over the decision that we take tonight? So to answer that decision, neoclassical realists would say, let's lay out all the possible decisions we could take tonight. To intervene or not intervene would be the first big one. So what would happen to American interests if we didn't intervene? If we let Colonel Gaddafi's troops slaughter the residents of Benghazi? Our credibility may decline. Our commitment to human rights and to decency might decline. Our ability to project influence into the Middle East would suffer. And as we know, he didn't take that decision. So then the next question on the table is, how do we intervene? How do we change the situation in Benghazi for the better? And then a panoply of tools. Oh, we've tried sanctions. We've closed down his embassy in Washington. What do we do instead? Do we put our own troops on the ground? Do we encourage other Arab states to put their troops on the ground? Or do we form a coalition with the French and the British, using our air power to back the revolt? Now, if neoclassical realism is right, then they would have gone through the strengths and the weaknesses of those potential decisions. Putting our own troops on the ground, what are the strengths of that? We're in control, we can do whatever we want. What are the weaknesses? We'll be seen as invaders, neo-imperial invaders. They'll probably start fighting us. Encouraging other Arab leaders to put troops on the ground. What are the strengths and the weaknesses? They won't do it. They're in revolt themselves. They haven't got the capacity. Oh, air power. We can use air power with our French and our British colleagues, and it was President Sarkozy and Prime Minister Cameron who were very keen to do that. Let's do that. Now, neoclassical realism would suggest that they would have worked out the strengths and the weaknesses of that. We won't have as much control. Our troops won't be in danger. We can get away with this. And then, finally, they would have had to consider, what would the American people say? Can we mobilize public opinion to back this use of power? Troops, no, we can't. Encouraging other neighbouring states, no, we can't. But they'll probably agree to the use of air power. Now, I have some rather big problems with this explanation of Barack Obama's decision-making. Firstly, I think it's difficult, if not impossible, to explain Obama's decision to use force to protect the Libyan people simply in terms of maximising US interests. What US interests were there in Libya? You could say, oh, Libya's got oil. But that oil was and continues to be exported by European oil companies. American oil companies weren't heavily involved in Libya. Libya isn't very strategic, or didn't seem to be then very strategic, on the Mediterranean coast. And finally, I think the huge problem with this explanation is that no one in the US government knew much about Libya at all. There aren't very many Libyan experts in the whole of the United States. So this careful weighing of information, should we do it, shouldn't we do it, how strong is Gaddafi's army, can we stabilize the country afterwards, I see no evidence that that careful weighing took place. That rationalism and neoclassical realism especially would ask for this group of people, key decision makers, to weigh up all the different odds as I've done it. And I don't think he had the time or the information over one evening when he took that decision to do what rationalism and neoclassical realism would have him do. Now, the second explanation, the bureaucratic politics explanation, I think is more interesting. Remember we said that if decisions are taken at the institutional level, then what's involved is a fight amongst different arms of government. And we saw on the previous slide, Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, America's leading diplomat, coming out very early on, demanding that the US use military force to protect the people of Benghazi. But also, rather interestingly, this man here, Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, the man in charge of all America's military forces, said in public, quotes, that anyone suggesting that a big American land army should be sent into the Middle East today needs his head examining. That's the chief military man in the whole of government, not only powerfully disagreeing with the Secretary of State Clinton, but also giving a warning to his boss, President Obama, saying, I don't agree with sending troops. You'd be mad if you did that. So there we have, in the run-up to this decision, the two most powerful decision makers beneath the president disagreeing with each other in public. Why would they do that? Well, as I said at the beginning, the American military had been involved since 2001 and 2003, so nearly 10 years and 8 years involved in these hugely violent, debilitating wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The last thing in the world they wanted to do was be driven into yet another military intervention with more troops on the ground, more unpopularity, and more dying. So why was Hillary Clinton in favour of it? Why did she promote this answer? Well, you have to understand that in the United States, the State Department, the diplomats, are the least important in the government. The State Department is underfunded. Its diplomats are seen as largely irrelevant to American power. And from the beginning of the Arab Spring, Hillary Clinton and the State Department used their championing of democratic change, the pushing regime change across the Middle East, as a way of expanding their power, as a way of making them more important. So against that background, imagine President Obama that night in the White House. His senior diplomat is saying, go kill some people, invade, use military force. His senior soldiers are saying, you'd be mad to put troops in there. Going for that resolution at the United Nations, which was going to be using air power and not military force, but also a lot of diplomacy, you can see as a fairly poor compromise between two different arguments within his own cabinet. So you could argue that he pushed for the next resolution in order to find a compromise between his two most powerful colleagues at the head of government. if that's true, if that's a valid explanation, this wasn't about American interests. This wasn't about the poor and threatened people of Benghazi, the poor Libyans. This was about him keeping peace in his cabinet and making sure Robert Gates and Hillary Clinton didn't have a public fight. That would be the bureaucratic model of politics. Now, again, as with any explanation, there are problems with this explanation as well. Barack Obama is the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, but he also is the only elected official in his cabinet. They all work for him, and if he disagreed with them, he could sack them. So stressing the overly fractured nature of the cabinet is a bit of a problem. I think it overstates it. There's some truth there, but it's a bit of a problem. You go to the next slide, please. The third approach is the one that we've already touched on, the bounded rationality approach of the Cognitive School. Barack Obama knows nothing about Libya. Susan Rice, who is now his national security advisor, the most important foreign policy person, but was then the United Nations ambassador, knows nothing about Libya. Hillary Clinton knows nothing about Libya. None of them knew anything about the country they were deciding whether to intervene in or not. So how did they understand Libya? They went to something they knew very well, that a lot of them, especially Susan Rice, had been junior government officials or mid-ranking government officials under President Clinton when Clinton refused to invade or get involved in the Rwandan genocide in Africa, and tens of thousands of innocent Rwandans were slaughtered. So that night, Susan Rice walked up to President Obama and whispered in his ear, "Sir, this is your Rwandan moment." Now, I think that's one of the most powerful statements in foreign policy analysis I have ever heard. Because when President Clinton refused to get involved in Rwanda and hundreds of thousands of people were murdered, he was seen as guilty, as to blame for that genocide. So when Susan Rice snuck up to the president and whispered in his ear, "Sir, this is your Rwandan moment," she's not only saying hundreds of thousands of people could be slaughtered in Libya. She is saying that. She's saying it's just like Rwanda. But she's also saying, in saying that, if you don't intervene, this will haunt you for the rest of your life. You will be blamed and feel guilty. You will have the deaths of Libyans on your hands. Now, if you said that to the president, or I said that to the president, are we offering him any choice? That is why that is such a powerful, but I suspect ultimately mendacious statement. Because Libya was nothing like Rwanda. The Rwandan genocide had been planned for years beforehand. That militias had been armed specifically to carry it out, and that radio stations had been set up to make sure it happened. There was no way that Susan Rice could have known how many people were going to die in Benghazi. But using that historical comparison, by convincing the president that this was comparable to Rwanda, she almost dictated what he had to do. He had no choice but to intervene. And the final approach to the intervention in Libya is constructivism. Now, I could ask the simple question, why on earth should the American president and his cabinet care what happens in Libya. They've never been there. They're never going to go there. There's not enough oil for them to be bothered about in Libya. It's not a strategic interest for the United States. It is for Italy, a little bit for France, a little bit. Why are they bothered? Now, to answer that question accurately, you have to start thinking about how President Obama saw his role in the world and saw America's role in the world. Do you think, as a counterfactual, there are people sitting in Tripoli in Libya saying, oh, I'm really worried about President Trump. Do you think we should go and intervene in America to stop them voting for him? It's ludicrous, isn't it? So what is it about an American president at the head of an American state that believed that a country that he'd never been to, that had little or no interest to America, deserved intervening in? So this, the constructivists would argue, is about America's sense of itself in the world. The crusading liberal power that needed to spread democracy, that had a role in protecting humanity. And there is a lot of truth in that. And it's, the constructivist would argue that unless you understand America's perception of itself and American presidents as seeing themselves as having global responsibilities, you can't in any way explain why they pushed for that resolution and pushed for Gaddafi's removal. Now, it's 3/4 of an hour in. Let me conclude. 3,000 innocent Libyans were killed between March and October 2011. So you're saying 3,000 people died in order that Gaddafi could be removed. And in the aftermath of that removal, President Obama could have said that was worth it. Because on the 7th of July 2012, Libyans held their first parliamentary elections. And on August 2012, a new democratically elected government stepped forward. But as I said, by September that year, the American consulate in Benghazi had been attacked and the American ambassador murdered. The June 2014 elections triggered a descent into civil war with the different militias fighting each other. And now we can say that in 2014, another 3,000 people were killed. In 2015, 1,500 people are killed, and this year already 1,500 people have been killed. So many more people have been killed since regime change than were killed during regime change. The country remains in civil war, and although the United States helped remove Gaddafi, they've not been very helpful in stabilizing the country afterwards. This is what foreign policy analysis is about, seeking to explain the decisions that statespeople made that result, at their worst, in thousands and thousands of people dying in other countries because they got it so badly wrong. Thank you very much.